Today, we're going to be hand sculpting 4 unique monsters for the tabletop.
We love playing tabletop RPGs here at Tabletop Time.
But to do that, we need some Pokemon, so we're going to make them ourselves.
It's tabletop time.
With the amazing artists at Insert Art, we designed brand new starter Pokemon for our player characters in our upcoming campaign.
Check out the Insert Art video to see the entire process.
And after that process, now that we have our designs, we can make these a reality.
So let's grab our sculpting tools, head down into the Tabletop Time studio, and get to work.
Hit the camera. Yeah. Okay.
Hit it. Kill it. I mean, in-game. My trainer is going to be based on the Ranger archetype, so very woodsman, very survivalist, and as such, I'm going to have a grass type. And to build that grass type, I'm going to be using green stuff, also Milliput.
My Pokemon trainer is a water type trainer, and she's also a breeder too, and she looks absolutely adorable, and her Pokemon absolutely matches her personality. It is so cute, and today I'm going to be using cosplay to make it come to life.
As for me, I'm GMing the campaign, which means I don't get to play. But I am making the Pokemon for Jazza and Elle. Jazza is playing a Pokemon professor geologist with a fire-type Pokemon, and I'm going to be using Blender to design that in 3D. But as for Elle's electric type, this super adorable teddy bear I'm going to attempt to make with a mix of both mediums. Some cosplay for an armature, Milliput and green stuff for the detail. So that's how we're going to do it. It's time to get started.
Ow!
And I think the best way to plan these kind of sculpts out is to set them in designated stages. Kind of think of it in terms of anatomy. You want to start with a skeleton and then keep adding on bits, building up muscles, skin, clothes, and then all the final details and accessories that will go onto that. It's also very important when you're sculpting that for the best results, you take your time and you let each stage dry and cure. So I'm going to try and do my best to achieve that here. So with that in mind, the best way to set this up for myself is to block out the absolute basic structure using Milliput, as that will dry a lot faster than green stuff. A couple of hours as opposed to a whole day. I'll work out the size I want and then lightly glue the rough shapes I have onto a base for ease of sculpting. And now with my little rubber ducky shape, I'm going to use isopropyl alcohol to smooth over the entire shape using a very soft brush. And the chemical nature of this will help smooth out the surface of the Milliput. With those in place, it's time to use a very fine tool just to squish out all of the toes. Pushing firmly down onto the base will also help anchor the feet to the base as well as all the little bushy parts accompanying them. Here I'll just make a couple of triangles of green stuff and push them straight on, working them around until I get the right shape. When I tried to create the ear leaves, I found that the pieces I'd attached were just still a little bit too big, so I delicately used a pair of clippers to cut them in half and to create 2 smaller leaves. This also had the added benefit of creating a nice sharp point to each leaf. A tiny bead of green stuff smushed onto either side of the head that I can use as a guide for painting them later. Now when it comes to doing the tail, I decided to create one big piece that I can work on. The simpler you can make the sculpting process, the easier it is to manage. So I'll take a large lump of green stuff and just stretch it out into a very elongated shape. And then by curving it slightly, I can get the desired shape. Now all that's left is that texture of the bush. I want the individual tufts to really stand out from the tail. So once again, I'm going to go in with those clippers. And while cutting into the tail, I can use the clippers to just lever up those parts, further distinguishing them from the tail. Now I'm not too worried about mushing this up with my fingers a little bit as I work on it, as once I attach it to the body, I can go back and just lever out all those tufts manually by hand again. However, for the process of actually attaching it, I decided to add just a little bit of this texture to the hindquarters of my numbat as well. Just a little dollop of green stuff and I'll blend that in with a tool so it seamlessly transitions into the rest of the Milliput. Then after I've created the same texture on the tail on the back of the numbat, as this is also evident in the concept art, I have a nice big tacky area with which to attach the tail. And just to make sure it's super secure, I'll use a tiny dollop of super glue as well. And there we have it, I have a Pokemon completely sculpted.
So it's time to get digital. This is something I've been playing with a lot more, but this will make the very first fully sculpted organic creature I've ever done. Made a bunch of weapons, bits, and equipment, but most of them don't require soft shapes. Thankfully though, Pokemon are super simple in designs, and Ignisilk is no exception. To create this, I made a bunch of sausages. These lovely sausages will become its legs, and I just bent them with a curve modifier. I created and deformed some spheres to create the head shape and the torso, and then again modified some cylinders to connect the sausage legs to the body. Using a mirror modifier, I would save work by only needing to do half of the model at a time. The most complicated part of this little creation was actually learning how to shrink wrap onto the 3D object. 3D design is a little bit interesting in that some of the things that are extremely simple both physically or on pen and paper are actually some of the more complex tasks to achieve. I did eventually figure out a way to do this by shrink wrapping and flattening some cylinders that had been deformed by the curve modifier and then extruding them out. Once this was done, done, the final step, aside from making some little eyes and fangs, was sculpting the fire on the tail. I went back and forth following the art and tried to turn that 2D design into 3D life. This model is going to be really tiny, so I'm excited to see how it prints. Chuck a couple of supports on it in Lychee, and here we go.
Something I have always loved is eyelashes on animals, so this was a very specific pinpoint I had given to Alicia. I wanted my Pokemon to appear overall cutesy and fun, but also look like it could hold itself up in battle. So with all that said and done, it was time to start shaping out my Pokemon. I started off by making just a couple of small balls, adding in a little bit of Vaseline just to keep it nice and smooth. Once I had my overall shapes figured out, I went ahead and started adding on his appendages. This included his axolotl style tail, his little dumpy legs, and his very froggy hands. I tried my best to smooth everything out, again with a little bit of Vaseline and some isopropyl alcohol. Once I was happy with how everything was looking, I left him in the oven for a little bit to bake and save my process. There were a couple of features on the illustration that sort of alluded to different shapes, and in some cases I could just paint this on. However, I wanted to create more of a 3D effect when it came to my Pokemon design. This can be seen in the jaw of my Pokemon and his tummy. I just really wanted these shapes to stand out a little bit more. I also made sure that the eyes were visible and added on his little axolotl spikes to finish. All I needed to do was put him in the oven to bake, and he's basically done. So while I was sculpting my Pokemon, I did tend to notice that I was going a bit bigger than everyone else. My Pokemon absolutely encompasses my base, but I kind of lost track of things and got really carried away in the process. But it's fine, my trainer is a Pokemon breeder, so I'm just gonna say she just has the biggest and best of her Pokemon type.
So the design Kat has drawn up for this little electric type Pokemon is a Sparky teddy bear. I think it's a nightlight crossed with a teddy bear, which is where it gets its electric typing from. Now the bulk of this model is what I'm going to build out of cosclay. Being a teddy bear, my shapes can be really soft and plump, and this won't be too challenging. However, he does have some mechanical components and a very complicated light bulb head, but I'll deal with that later. For the torso, I just make a soft little lump, almost teardrop shaped, and I'm going to press that onto a 25mm base to help me with the scaling and also to hold it still for now. In this lump, I use some sculpting tools with a little bit of Vaseline to make sure all the surfaces are smooth and to add some creases and form into that torso. This done, I create two more soft teardroppy noodles and wedge them on either side of the bear. These will become his legs. I can just use the sculpting tool to press the ends of the legs at the hip onto the model and keep working back and forth until it's connected. And once this is done, I can create a small crease, reforming the natural shapes of the bear's body. The torso and legs are looking pretty good, so I can repeat the exact same step with the arms, having them come down between his body and rest on the ground. With this central torso done, it's time to bake it before we move on to more complicated sculpting.
And my favorite thing about using these oven baked clays is you basically get to save your progress. So the teddy bear's body's looking good, it's time to save my game. And then I'll keep sculpting.
The body is sculpted up nicely and it's time for me to do the head. I put a little bit of toothpick in the center of this model to help fasten it in place. I'm not too worried about anything happening to this. If satay skewers can hold up in an oven at low heat, I'm pretty sure this will be fine. Now the complication I have here is I need to make a half dome, or slightly more than a half dome. That's because the top half of this bear's head is a light bulb. So to create this half shape, I pressed on a ball of cosclay onto the top of the neck, using that skewer as a bit of a tide marker for where it should end. I could place my thumb or my finger here and then sculpt up to that point, creating a slightly more than semicircle. Use the sculpting tool and Vaseline to smoothly connect all of this onto the torso, and then worked back and forth, squeezing out a little bit of a snout and using a toothpick to press in the shape of a mouth, while working back and forth until I was happy with the outline of a bear's face. All of the detail, the teeth, the tongue, the eyes and the ears will all be done in green stuff as I start to do more detailed sculpting as the final steps. But at this stage, I need to make sure that it's going to fit with my plan for the light bulb. I cut the bottom off a googly eye and take the plastic chunk out of the middle of it, and then I shape the head to fit this top plastic section. This dome will be put on later because obviously we don't want to put some soft plastic in the oven. Before the head can go into the oven, it does need its light bulb moment. So I untangle a little bit of Games Workshop's barbed wire and use the thinner wire section, which is already nicely curled, as that central filament of the light bulb, sticking that into the head. This all goes into the oven while I set about making one of the elements for his butt. That's right, this this teddy bear has a light switch on its butt, so I need to create that. To do that, I recycle by using the little plastic bead from the googly eye and carve a slot into that. We then also have a section of brass gears. I find one that is appropriately sized for the outer circle and cut all of the spokes out of it, and then glue it on. Final element here is a bit of brass rod, which I will use green stuff on in my final steps to create the handle, and this will complete the teddy bear bum switch. With all of these elements finished, I can bring it all together and start for my final sections of sculpting.
Finally, I get to paint my little Pokemon. Now I'm going to start with a black base coat, but give it a very heavy zenithal of white. Primarily so that I have some darkness in the recesses, but I really want the vivid white to carry the color of the Pokemon. The Pokemon need to be a really vibrant color, and this will allow me to easily get that effect. Now my Pokemon has been given a very sandy green color, so once I try and color match that to the best of my ability, I can start base coating the entire model, making sure for each coat to dry before I apply the next to get that really nice clean coverage. Then with that done, I'm going to start blocking out all the areas that are a different color, the stripes on the face and the underbelly in particular, before moving on to the darker patterns on the rear end. I'll paint in the leaves as I go. When it comes to creating those nice curved patterns on top of a spherical object, I like to work in multiple strokes, slowly moving outwards with every pass, so I can maintain as much control as possible. Then when that's done, I can start working on all the little details, painting the bushes in the tail, the markings on the face, as well as the stripes on the back. Then to give the really nice cel-shaded Pokemon look, I'm going to take my base colors and mix just a tiny bit of brown and black with them. Just enough to tint them slightly and create that shadowed look. And I'll use my concept art as a rough guide, but wherever that fails me, I'll use my best judgment to try and work out where the shadows should fall. For the final touches, I'll use a steady hand to paint around the eyes, moving back and forth if I feel I put just a bit too much in the wrong place. Then I'll carefully dot in the round red eyes, creating what is for now the most terrifyingly angry Pokemon I've ever seen. But this will change from angry to cute very quickly as we add in the iris, paint in the eyelids, and add that nice reflective dot. For a final touch, I'll just give a tiny highlight to the edges of the ears, and at the end of the snout, just behind the black nose. And we have an absolutely adorable little Pokemon that I can't wait to do the roleplay with. I'm also going to keep this brown basing on it, as it really evokes that encounter art of the Pokemon just appearing on a small bit of uncovered dirt in the random encounters. Also, it really contrasts nicely with the green. All in all, I'm really happy with this.
So recently I've been watching a lot of Rogue Hobbies videos, and I really enjoy the way that Louise paints up her minis. So I'm going to use a very similar style here on my Pokemon, starting off by covering the entire model in a nice bubblegum pink, making sure I get into all the cracks and crevices to give me a really nice base to work from. I then moved on to my secondary color, a light baby blue. Once I was happy with the coverage, I could start working on the shadows. To make up my shadows, I started with my base color and worked in a darker shade of each. For example, using purples on my pinks and a darker blue on my light blue. I applied these in all the areas where I thought my model would have a shadow. Once this was done, I started picking out some of the features. As I mentioned before, I made a couple of the elements on my Pokemon 3D, so I needed to paint these in a slightly lighter color. And the last step of the process was to try and make these gigantic anime eyes. I had a huge surface area to work with, so it wasn't too hard to make these look really adorable. And that final little white dot definitely brought it all together. I also decided to apply a little bit of gloss varnish to the eyes so they looked nice and watery. My Pokemon is absolutely massive, so it was going to take up a lot of the surface area. But because my Pokemon is a water Pokemon, I decided to base it in, well, water. I went ahead and started painting this up, using different types of blue to create my watery scene. Once it was all dry, I applied a gloss varnish on top and waited for that to dry. And I'm pretty much done. And I think it looks absolutely adorable. So I got given the task of painting up Jazz's Pokemon, which is inspired by a spider and fire. Dave did an amazing job of modeling this up in Blender, and I think it came out really well. The 3D print also came out super crisp, so it was a really good base to start painting on. I'm going to use a very similar method to what I had done for my Pokemon, just on a much smaller scale, also incorporating a more warmer tone palette. I started off with my base colors, applying a cream color to his body, a bright orange to his legs, and then red on all of the accent colors. I then created my shadows using more of a brown tone and mixing these in with the base colors. Once this was done, I added just a little touch of highlight to some of the raised edges and gave him his nice shiny anime eyes. For his base, again keeping in with that warm tone, I decided I wanted to try and mimic a volcanic sort of terrain, putting down a texture paint and covering it in rocks. Once this was all dry, I dry brushed everything up and then glued Jazz's Pokemon to the base.
It's painting time! That's right, it's time for me to paint my little kabloom. This should be a fairly simple paint job because, well, it's a teddy bear. But the main thing is that skull going to pop off? Let's find out. I did get a knife under that plastic googly eye and popped it up fairly easily. And thankfully it actually stayed attached at the very, very front, which meant I didn't drop it and it didn't get out of line. This little sticking point that was pure happenstance actually ensured that I didn't change the alignment of the head cap and made sure it would go back on afterwards. With this popped up, I painted all the green stuff on the inside dark brown and then continued across the entire bear. I then painted inside the head area with some more of that yellowy glow from the light and then sealed his head back on and glued his bear ears back on as well. With these primary browns established, I went up with 3 more layer highlights, keeping them scratchy and cartoony. And this fairly quickly established all of the coloration on the bear. For the inside of the mouth, I used some blood red, but this was looking pretty creepy, so I very quickly cleaned it up with some Carroburg Crimson wash, and when that was dry, a bit of tan for the tongue. I bounced back and forth on multiple areas on this model as each area was drying, with the butt switch being painted in a deep brass and highlighted up to gold, and then a tiny bit of silver, and the scarf being painted in some very Space Wolfy greys. I did find I wasn't happy with this at the end as I highlighted it all the way up to a wolf grey, and found it was just a little bit grey and lacked saturation for a Pokemon. So I glazed the whole thing in Talosar blue, and this brought back that gorgeous cartoony blue hue. His teeth needed to be whitened, and his nose needed to be a little black dot like most bears have, with a white dot as a point of reflection. Painting cartoony things is fun. The inside of his eyes were painted a nightmarish yellow glow, and I still can't decide if this little tyke is cute or horrifying to behold. Personally, I think I'm leaning slightly more towards Nightmare Fuel. The bear all painted up, I just needed to do the base, and I thought it would be really cute with the pose if it looked like the bear was playing with or pouring at a pile of flowers. So I got a nice tuft of yellow flowers to match the yellow of the bear and shoved them in between his bear paws, then filled out the rest of his base with some very short grass. I also used one conspicuously extremely long grass tuft because, you know, Pokemon, tall grass, it all makes sense. But what might not have made sense to you by now is why we're spending so much time on creating weird little custom Pokemon. Well, why don't I tell you?
So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a huge full studio collab, which is really exciting. You can see some of the trees and diorama setup that Jazz has made in a video over on his channel. It's all coming together really nicely. But where is it leading? Well, it all leads to Tabletop Time roleplay, which is really our passion. We've been putting so much into this Pokemon campaign for fun. We all grew up with Pokemon. We're all that age, and we thought it would be so much fun to adapt a role-playing system, homebrew a bunch of rules, and just go on a Pokemon adventure. So that's what it's all for. That's the purpose of everything. Jazz has made so much terrain, insert art of designed Pokemon. We have sculpted them because they're going to be our minis for our little campaign. So if you'd like to check that out, the links are in the description, and we'd love it if you could go and join us on our silly little fan Pokemon adventure. It's going to be heaps of fun, and we're really excited. It's actually filming the first episode tonight as of me filming this, and we're all super hyped. So we hope you'll have as much joy watching it as we have preparing for it. But with that little interlude aside, I think it's time for us to check out our final Pokemon, our little
Thank you to all of our amazing patrons who allow us to make videos like this. We know this one probably isn't the most popular for our audience, making Pokemon for our role-playing game, but every now and then you've got to do something just for yourselves and just to have a bunch of fun, and it's because of you patrons that we can do that and share it with you, so thank you so much. And thank you to our latest patrons, Grimtooth Industries, Dr. Bones, Demon Slayer, Die Atlas, and Rob Salata. You are all fantastic. Thanks for joining up. I hope you enjoy the content we put out there, our weekly vlog updates behind the scenes, a monthly mini report, and our Patreon Discord. Catch you all soon.
Our cute little Pokemon are all sculpted. They're looking great, everyone, and it's only the beginning. I think we've printed like 20 Pokemon that we're going to be using in our campaign, so there's a lot of painting happening at the studio. Oh yeah.
A huge thank you to Insert Art for designing our trainers and our Pokemon for us. I think they came out really, really well.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that for some reason, please go check it out. It's awesome.
And also, Jazza has sculpted Viridian City. 3D. It is a scale 3D model. You have to see it. It's amazing. And finally, see where it all ends up by going over to Tabletop Time Roleplay and watching us there, watching us be silly.
Yeah, check out the vaults, check us live. We'll be doing this for quite a few weeks. So that's really exciting.
Don't forget to catch the ball if that's not trademarked.
So many things for them to remember. So many things.